Hi, I'm Shelby Williams with Plano City Council. For a confluence of reasons, this is the first video recap I've given you in a couple of meetings, so we're going to jump right in. The very first item tonight in the preliminary open meeting was the review of the housing tax credit report. We had a consultant take a look at how we should conduct our housing tax credit letters of support or no objection. Now, these are letters that applicants who want to construct taxpayer subsidized housing, they call it affordable housing, but that means taxpayer subsidized housing, how they apply to the state for those tax subsidies. The city's role is to provide letters of support or no objection, or even letters of objection. So we have gone through revisions to our housing tax credit process several times since I came on council, and they have been fraught with issues, which suggests to me that there is a larger underlying issue and that fiddling around the edges is not really going to resolve anything long term. And so we asked for an independent consultant to take a look at this. The consultant gave their report at the last council meeting. You didn't get a recap on that, so consider this two recaps in one. I had a number of issues with the consultant's recommendation, but tonight council went through those recommendations one at a time, and we actually decided not to follow the consultant's recommendations in a number of areas. I'll go through those in brief. The first is that the consultant recommended that city staff make the recommendations for whether to grant a housing tax credit letter of support or no objection. We're going to keep that with the Community Relations Commission. I feel very strongly that a council-appointed board or commission should make those determinations. Second, the consultant recommended that we not require that the applicants already have their zoning to apply for the housing tax credit. Presumably on the basis that none of our neighbors do, and also that if we were to consider the zoning after the housing tax credit and denied it, that could land us in legal trouble. But that's the exact opposite of what we were proposing, and we are proposing that the applicants secure zoning first, exactly in order to avoid legal entanglements, or imperial entanglements for you Star Wars fans. So we're going to either require that the zoning be attained in advance, or at least give additional points in our scoring rubric for applicants who have already secured their zoning. Because think about it, if the zoning is just not appropriate for an area, if the development is just not appropriate for an area based on the zoning, then you want to know that first, because then the question of housing tax credits becomes moot, especially if you flip the equation and you give the housing tax credits and then you consider the zoning, as has happened. That could present legal challenges. Next, we want to give preference to developers who have a track record of working within our community. Likewise, we want property management companies to be local, or give preference to property management companies that are local. Now, one of the things the city does is provide, and this just results in a point on the TDHCA, that's Texas Housing Department and Community Affairs, scoring rubric to grant the tax subsidies. But if the city invests in it, then that gives them additional points, or an additional point. The city does offer $500 in the form of a waived building permit fee. I went ahead and I voted for that one, but I'm kind of on the fence about it. That is still a subsidy, and I think that shouldn't be offered necessarily. Or conversely, if we really believe that this deserves a partnership and we're going to invest, then let's make it for more than $500. And lastly, we have required, or at least weighted, letters of support from the community, and we're going to keep that against the consultant's recommendation. I believe that having the applicant attain letters of support from the community is important, because as I said in the meeting tonight, I'm familiar with a number of development projects who have hosted community information meetings, which suspiciously most members of the community had no idea were happening. Like even in adjacent properties. So having to have that letter of support, or at least getting additional points for having a letter of community support, makes the applicant, makes the developer go out of their way to inform the community, whereas they're not necessarily motivated to do so otherwise. We then had a Haggard Farms presentation about a proposed PID, Public Improvement District. Now this was basically foreshadowing the final 4 votes of the evening, but long story short, we're creating a PID, Public Improvement District, around the Haggard Farm development. Now this was already approved, it's ancient history. It's going to be primarily multifamily, but there's going to be the Public Improvement District, which is a specifically narrowly defined geographic area, which is going to assess an additional property tax levy only on properties within that little geographic area. Those additional property taxes that the people purchasing property in there are going to pay are going to go for specific public improvements in that area. They could take a number of forms, sidewalks, parks, etc. But the point is, with a PID, a public improvement district, they are paying for it, you are not. Bear that in mind. That's going to be salient later on. So the PID is broken into 2 areas with 2 different bonds. The city issues the bonds and then pays the bonds back through the additional levies on those properties within the PID. Again, not with your property taxes, unless you purchase property within the PID. So one of the bonds was for $5 million. The other bond was for just a hair under $16.5 million. Next, we had a presentation on retail rehabilitation. So this is a number of things to try to improve some of our failing retail areas, and we have many. Plano was built out in bursts in the 80s and 90s primarily, just before e-commerce changed everything. So there are a number of, the proposal was for grants to do a number of things like facade improvement, demolition, public improvements. I was on board with the benefit of most of these things, except for lease buy-downs. That was, it might have had a public improvement measure to it, but that would go overwhelmingly to the private benefit of the leaseholder. Now, one of the things I asked to explore, and what I think is a perfect vehicle for this, a perfect mechanism for this, is something I've spoken about frequently for a number of years, and that is the concept of tax abatements for all, in this case specifically for small businesses. Large developments like Concrete Mall, Toyota, they get tax abatements, which I agree with because they are improving property, whether it's a green field or an old mall. They're investing money to improve it, and then because the value of that property goes up after they improve it for obvious reasons, they're going to get slapped with a lot more property taxes. And that's not fair. But the problem I have isn't that they get the tax abatement, it's that the little guy doesn't. So I think as a measure of incrementalism to move the needle in the right direction, for the retail rehabilitation grants, we can explore tax abatements for that. So let's say you have some four-corner retail and that really needs a facelift and maybe needs some renovation. Now, they don't necessarily have enough motivation to invest in that themselves because, well, first, it's probably hard to quantify the economic benefit to that strip mall. Second, they actually have to invest in it. But if they're going to receive the tax abatement, or even we're going to explore a revolving fund that simulates tax abatements so they can receive the grant money, let's just call it $20,000 today. I'm making up the numbers, but they receive $20,000 today. And then over a period of a few years, they pay that grant back through the additional property taxes that they're having to pay the city because the value of the property increased. So that's money collected in property taxes through the increased value of the property that would not have existed if they had not made those improvements. If you find that statement confusing, that's just one more reason why our current property tax system in Texas needs to go. But I digress. If we have such a fund where we can invest in properties to revitalize aging and blighted areas where the taxpayer is not on the hook, not even through a PID, but if they were paying $20,000 in property taxes this year, but they give their property a facelift, and next year they would have to pay $25,000 in property taxes because the property is now worth that much more. Again, I'm making up the numbers. That's $5,000 extra in property taxes they would not have had to pay, and for which they shouldn't necessarily be penalized. If it doesn't cost the city or the school district or the county additional expense in providing services, then we shouldn't necessarily be charging for it, but that's our property tax system. So that extra $5,000 of property tax revenue, if that instead goes over a period of years to pay back the initial investment, then everybody wins. Taxpayers aren't on the hook. We revitalize blighted areas or aging areas, and the property owner gets the benefit, and they don't get punished. So that's something I feel very passionate about. Next, we explored creating a TIRZ, that's Tax Increment Reinvestment Zone, which is a similar principle for the EDS campus. Which we did consider tonight, the EDS campus. I'll skip to the punchline, that got tabled. I'll explain a little more in a bit. But the tax increment would be for 25 years for that TIRZ number 5. We already have 4 TIRZ, tax increment reinvestment zones. An increment for 25 years of 65%. So basically, the increased value of the property after the redevelopment, the property owner would, or a portion of that additional property tax revenue would be plowed back into the public improvements in that TIRZ area. It's similar to a PID, but it's a different mechanism. We opened the regular meeting with the Sons of the American Revolution, presenting several awards honoring Plano's first responders. First was Detective Stephen Howell, who was the Detective of the Year this year, for busting several auto theft operations. So very good. Denise Alvarez, who was the police civilian employee of the year. Trevor Carpenter, who was the firefighter of the year. Lee Jennings, who was the paramedic of the year. And Gabby Chase, who was the public safety communicator specialist, dispatch specialist of the year. So congratulations to all of you. We then had oaths of office for incoming boards and commissions members. Then we had certificates of appreciation for outgoing boards and commissions members. Then we considered the 2023 Edward Byrne Justice Assistance Grant Funds. So that's a federal grant that's given every year to our area, which actually comprises McKinney, Frisco, and Plano. So Plano is going to receive $27,670 from that award. And the 3 cities, the Sheriff's Department doesn't receive anything directly from that grant. So the 3 cities basically take a quarter of the grant money and give it to the Sheriff's Office. Then we considered the EDS redevelopment, but not for long because that got tabled to the next meeting. There were a few issues that were discussed prior to the meeting, a few questions, and we want to give that a couple of weeks to bake and tie up some of those loose ends before it's presented to us. So the rest of that discussion happened in executive session, discussing legal ramifications, which I am not at liberty to divulge because it occurred in executive session. And what happens in executive session stays in executive session, but unlike Vegas, a judge can actually order that divulged. Next, we discussed a drone delivery ordinance. That also got tabled. I watched the planning and zoning meeting for this, and I did ask tonight, I'm struggling to see what the problem is that this ordinance would solve. Now, to give staff full credit, they spent a lot of time on it. It was a very detailed ordinance, but I think it's premature. The point was made that almost no other city in Texas has a drone delivery ordinance. Now, of course, drone delivery, that's like dropping off packages via drone instead of in an Amazon truck. That is very, very, very new. But like many very, very, very new things, We're not sure of all the ramifications yet. So the mayor adroitly said that we need to educate ourselves on this, and a couple of local drone delivery providers were offering to have council view their operations in the next couple of weeks and see how it actually works. And I agree with the mayor, we need to educate ourselves, and I think we need to educate ourselves in a variety of ways that weren't necessarily touched on here. The biggest point of contention that some of the drone delivery operators had was the proposed requirement for screening walls, either masonry screening walls like brick or living screens, that might impact their operations. The mayor raised the point that we need to address the consistency with our open storage requirements. They're not necessarily being applied consistently throughout the city, but Planning Director Christina Day did mention that our current zoning ordinance specifies that if a use is not permitted explicitly under zoning ordinance, then it is prohibited. So that was the impetus behind creating a drone delivery ordinance, is so that it's not de facto prohibited. But I do want to understand a couple of things. If it is prohibited, how do we have operators currently? And second, if a use is not permitted and it is prohibited and that sticks, why does that not apply to short-term rentals? So again, the mayor's point about consistency is pertinent. Next, we considered an ordinance to allow pet funeral homes and crematories. So a couple of notes. These will only be allowed in light industrial 1 and 2 zoning districts, and only with a specific use permit, an SUP. An SUP says that regardless of the zoning, council, planning and zoning and council, have to explicitly approve that use. In this case, a pet funeral home or crematory. And we also put in a provision that they must maintain their equipment, incinerators, let's call it what it is, according to manufacturer specifications. Where we have heard of previous issues with odor, it has been because of maintenance issues with the equipment. So we did specify that the city could take action for any nuisance complaints related to odor or noise, but also that they must maintain their equipment according to manufacturer specifications. That passed. We did then consider a zoning ordinance expanding the ability to operate temporary emergency shelters. Now, the idea here is that under emergency weather events, that could be not just freezes like we had a couple of years ago during Snowmageddon, Winter Storm Uri, or record heat like we've had this year, but tornadoes, any specific weather event where emergency shelter is needed, an emergency weather event, as determined by the city manager or a designee. Now, I didn't get to this, but I think any emergency declaration should come from the mayor and automatically have to be ratified by council within 2 weeks. But that was the other provision. An actual declared disaster could also trigger this. Now, we already have provisions for that is declared by the mayor. Now, there was a phrase in here, and this is why I ultimately did not vote for it, or one of the reasons I ultimately didn't vote for it, that a facility, I'm going to explain several things here, specifically a religious facility, which is only defined as in our zoning ordinance as a place whose primary purpose is religious observance. And a religious facility is allowed by right in every single zoning category in our city, which means every single structure in our city, from a house to a tool shed to a church to city hall, could be declared a religious facility simply by virtue of saying, okay, the primary purpose of this facility is now religious observance. And the language that follows is can be operated for up to 30 days, quote, under normal conditions, and with no more than 14 people. I don't know what under normal conditions means, and I wasn't able to get a clear answer. We finally moved forward with the vote. Being unclear on what under normal conditions meant, I voted against it, but it passed. So we now have that. The next 4 items went in rapid succession. We then considered the service and assessment plans and the bonds for both portions of the Haggard PID. So again, because I said the word bond, big scary word, remember that the bonds for a PID, you are not on the hook for. The city's general fund is not obligated to pay those back. Those bonds are paid back by property owners within the PID. And thanks to Councilman Riccadelli's efforts a couple of years ago, we require that if somebody is to purchase property in the PID, that they get a great big glaring warning on its own piece of paper saying that they are going to be assessed the additional tax levy because they are in a PID and how much that will be. So they are on the hook to pay those bonds back, the property owners who purchase property in the PID, not you. So with that, I'm Shelby Williams with Plano City Council. Good night. Really good morning, because I'm only going to publish this in the morning. But whenever you watch it, good morning, good afternoon, good night, and God bless.